Hey, Collide. Welcome to BDE in the week that saw Landman back on the air.
And I have great anticipation about watching Landman Season 2, Episode 1. Chuck et al., Landman Pro, Bro Crew recap. And I will just say this about the episode. It was campier than I expected.
The deep dive that nobody asked for.
Not your episode, the real actual premiere episode of Season 2.
So Gore actually made a really good point is we can nitpick it. We can call it campy. We can disagree.
Yeah.
We finally have a story where the oil guy's a hero. You know,
right. Who cares?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Who cares?
I think I told you before we got started, my son, who's recovering from UCL surgery here in beautiful near downtown Memphis, but we decided to binge Landman starting over, which is only one season, but I figured it'd be better with his somewhat loopy. But he was asking some really good questions. You know, is that really how things work? And I was very consistent in my response. I said, I don't care.
Yeah,
you're entertained.
Well,
you're interested.
Bohr had another good thing because I mean, in the shale revolution, it takes you, you know, from drilling a well to completing it to flow back, you know, best case 30 days before you truly know if you have even an inkling of a good well or not. And, you know, in Landman, it happened in 30 seconds with the baby out on the site. And, you know, Matt's whole take was, we're not going to sit there for 30 days on a TV show. So we just condensed it to 30 seconds. But, you know, it's great.
I did tell him my tongue-in-cheek joke when in season 1 where they make the snap decision to work over the 35-year-old well. And all of a sudden, trucks are rolling. They're out there. They're rigging up. You know, it takes a phone call. I said, my quip was, I didn't know workovers were on DoorDash.
Oh, that's awesome.
But when they brought the well back on, you know, they immediately knew that it was 250 barrels a day. But again, we don't care. This has got you captivated. Learn more.
Yeah, man.
So it's cool.
It's good stuff. So I don't actually know the full connection to this. I need to go research it, but I believe our buddy Greg Beard is now at the DOE in charge of making loans.
So he took over the LPO role.
I think so. I was looking on LinkedIn, and he had the press release of the story we're about to tell. So I'll let you tell the story, and I'll look Greg up on LinkedIn and give us the evidence. But it says, you know, Greg Beard, Department of Energy Loan Programs Office.
Yeah, so he took the seat that was previously held by Jigger Shah.
Maybe so, yeah.
It caught my attention this morning because, you know, at the height of the last year's election and leading up to the inauguration, and then in the immediate aftermath, there was a lot of testimony to the effect that, look, they did a big jam job in the short period of time, you know, just shoving LPO and other DOE grant dollars, and we've been fairly critical of the loan program. And I think for the casual observer, the big kind of black eye for the LPO, which has been around since 2005, it was part of the Clean Energy Policy Act, so it's been around for 20 years. And it's not something that's seemingly arcane, but Solyndra, which was the big flame out in the Obama administration, is the thing everyone points to.
Right.
And this current story, we've got news of the administration through the LPO granting Constellation a $1 billion LPO loan to facilitate the refurbishment and restart of 3 Mile Island Unit 1. It was the undamaged 3 Mile Island. It's called the Crane Energy Complex now. And that is the nuclear reactor that is going to, or the nuclear power station that's going to be dedicated to Microsoft providing 880 megawatts of power to its compute to run its compute in Pennsylvania. So, this is something that I think I've been guilty of. Look, we're just throwing money willingly at just about everything seemingly alternative and venture without a lot of due diligence and underwriting, which is probably not mostly fair. But this is one of the recent examples that we're getting about addressing what's really critical and catching up on electric both generation and transmission infrastructure, and using an advantage loan program to do those things. So that follows, I don't recall precisely when, but AEP got a $1.6 billion loan from the LPO for transmission line upgrades, which I think we all agree is critical, and should be one of the priority focus areas as this this power demand growth resumes at a level we haven't seen in a couple of decades, if ever.
Yeah, I go back to my grumpy libertarian self of the government shouldn't be doing any of this stuff. The market ought to be doing it. But the one thing I've kind of talked myself into, maybe. So if I've had 2 glasses of wine, I'll kind of say, okay, maybe. Maybe the government should fund what I'll just call wild ass experimental technology stuff. Maybe the market wouldn't invest dollars on it, but just kind of the mad scientist type, just because somebody's got to do it. And it seems like stuff always comes out of that. I can maybe live with a tiny bit of that, but just in a world with $1 trillion deficits, I don't know why we're doing this stuff. No offense to my friend Greg Beard, because I'm sure he'll do a good job of it.
It's a better framework, I would argue, without being able to kind of tear up the hugely complex and convoluted, like RTO structures that we've built over the decades, where you've got varying stakeholders with varying priorities across multi-state regions, and transmission is the big one. There is a lot of collateral benefit to the work that's going to be done and is being done at 3 Mile Island. So that's a little bit that one's a little bit of a different animal because it's being restarted for a single customer.
Yeah, I mean, I can get into maybe some national security type stuff. Okay, we need to throw some money at the energy infrastructure here, because if not, we won't have an AI data center here because of whatever. So yeah, begrudgingly, I could probably get talked into that sort of stuff. But I'll as a non-elected official bloviating podcaster, I'll just say that I'll pontificate that this is all evil. But I could kind of. I could kind of see if I were Troy Nehls in Congress and had to vote for some stuff, I could probably make an exception here or there.
Having flown a lot lately on kind of last minute things, I have had more than one thought about privatizing things like the FAA and TSA, right?
Yeah.
So, but there are these things, especially transmission, that fall into that kind of gray area or fuzzy area of public good, which I remember from my Chicago public economy class, that there's always a scarcity and there's always a competing priority. So if there is some level of normalization as it relates to financing that the government has to be involved with because it is a public good, I would argue that transmission, especially as part of the electrical system, is a quasi-public good. But there's so many conflicting and competing priorities, and we can get into what happens in New England and Massachusetts wanting to put more renewables, and because of the way the RTO is set up, then cost for transmission to support that renewables is allocated pro rata to states in that group that don't benefit from it. So politically, it's a really sticky wicket.
And I hate to insinuate stuff without having any evidence, but okay, I'll go ahead and kind of do this. How much did Microsoft give to the East Wing ballroom? You know, and I don't think for a second Greg Beard would be part of anything like that. So I don't mean to insinuate that, Greg, but you just hate kind of the appearance of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that and frighteningly coincidental with Bill Gates's essay.
Correct.
Right? So there's some non-monetary things, perhaps, that you're moving into tinfoil hat territory. But the one thing I'll say that surprised me, again, because of preconceived notions or biases that have historically, at least for me, been kind of anti-LPO, is that I didn't realize that the default rate was only 3.3% over the course of the history of the LPO. And one of the shining examples of that is that Tesla took an LPO loan back in 2010. They paid it off by 2013.
We could, actually make the case there of new technology, domestic manufacturer, et cetera, and talk ourselves into that. But, I'm still kind of in the camp of, we shouldn't be doing that stuff. But, so I haven't read the Doomberg piece yet, but I do like the fact
Shocking.
Fisher. I've been selling software.
We can tell by the colored shirt.
Yeah, exactly. I think Brian Sheffield, we went and made a pitch to sell some software to Formentera, and I walked into Brian's office afterwards, and he goes, "I honestly have never seen you in a collared shirt." I was like, "Well, fair enough."
Much less the one that has long sleeves and buttons all the way up.
There you go, and not ripped. But I do love the fact Fisher Tropes technology is making a comeback. So tell us what's going on in China.
Well, it's not really making a comeback as far as China is concerned, although I think it's been off the radar because, the coal to liquids that we've attempted here in the U.S. have shown to be, look, if you contemplate large commercial scale, because of things like the abundance of domestic natural gas and the fact that we've got, other competing technologies that offer a better cost solution, at least as it comes to power generation. And I'm mainly speaking to the natural gas that comes off the coal to liquids or is part of the derivative of the process. But this Doomberg piece, which is called Closed Loop, was out this morning. And it really tackles two things. It tackles what they're doing in coal to liquids and also tackles this newer alternative nuclear technology, which is thorium molten-salt reactor. So we'll talk about the coal to liquids part first. And they're doing it already at fairly large scale up in the northwestern kind of autonomous Inner Mongolia region, with plans to essentially double what they've got online from today by 2030. And that'll, if the projections are even calculable, then we're talking about pretty significant displacement of both oil and natural gas because of the supply that's added from coal to liquids. And, that's on the order of, I think, 1.9 BCF a day and about 1.2 or 1.3 million barrels of oil per day. Not trivial amounts when we think about, LNG moving from here to there or imports of crude oil and refined product to China. So it also points out that, they've got very stable long-term political and policy decision-making standpoints or landscapes, which is purely a function of their authoritarian system and way of life, and pointing everyone, 1 billion 1.4 billion people all in the same direction. But it points out that China, I think, has had a long-term foundational or fundamental view is we're not going to do things that make our energy security, our national security more vulnerable by ceding control of critical supply chains, even if the economics of natural gas or LNG import are better, significantly better than coal to liquids. We have the indigenous resource that we can use, and it's not certainly a market-based from a market-based standpoint. It's not a rational solution, but that doesn't matter because they've got the resources and the wherewithal to make it happen at scale. And as you pointed out at the start of this segment, it is a technology that is literally over a century old. And Germany used it to a significant degree in World War II.
Yeah, the one time an oil embargo might have actually worked in the world was when we shut the Nazis off, and they used Fischer tropes because they did have coal. Supposedly their tanks didn't operate as well as on stuff refined from oil, but at the end of the day, they did run. They were able to do it.
And this is not just kind of the transportation or the motor fuels or the natural gas for power generation. This is, precursors in petrochemical finished products like plastics. And so if I control all that, it may be from an unconventional stream of feedstocks, then that means that I'm more insulated from the whims of supply chain disruption, embargoes, sanctions like that. And certainly the most prominent example of that, which has probably accelerated some things in China, is, the trade war that's being waged since the start of the Trump administration. Yeah. But I don't think this is the catalyst for that. I think it's been going on just in their mindset in terms of how they think about energy security. And we've seen it because, their coal numbers keep going up. They're going to do what's best, principally for energy and national security. And everything else, that we've spent a lot of time distracted with in the West, has, and it made me think, what have we been doing over the last 40 or 50 years in seeding all this as a constitutional republic and certainly a capitalist leaning civilization, where all of a sudden we look up and a lot of the things we critically depend on for manufacturing and other things are now the things that we need to make that stuff, or if it's made somewhere else, to have it within your boundaries, I think in the extreme is that's a real strength advantage from a national security standpoint. And we've talked about it with AI and chips and everything else. And I think this is just, an interesting kind of detour into something like coal to liquids. Who even talks about that anymore? Well, here we are, and they're doing it at scale.
Yeah, no, I used to be the biggest free trader on the planet, and then you go through a pandemic where you can't get toilet paper. And there's actually probably some of this stuff we need to be more thoughtful about and planning about. Again, kind of libertarian in me hates the brute force of the federal government, but, the Constitution should not be a death pact, and so kind of thinking through things like, should we have a Fischer tropes plant somewhere that could operate in case of an embargo, whatever. We probably ought to be more thoughtful about that. I wish Trump were more surgical with his tariffs and actually had, some reasoning behind kind of each one and all, but I've gone from literally Milton Friedman level free trader to somewhere a little closer, but not quite there in terms of what I'll call very, very moderate protectionism.
Speaking of tariffs, it's been fun to watch the game of Twister. You and I are old enough to remember the contortions that they've gone through from just a public relations and press conference standpoint, when the very straightforward and pointed questions are, okay, we're going to make exceptions now, or we're going to exempt certain things in the food category, things like coffee and beef, where people are getting still beat up pretty hard on ultimate consumer pricing. But how does that square with the thesis that the exporting countries pay the tariffs?
Well, where I think the distinction lies, and somebody in the Trump administration, I do think appreciates this, and I wish they would articulate it. If I have a factory that has a lot of fixed costs to it, I built a factory that cost $100 million, and it cost me $1 million a year to employ the people to actually build the widgets. There are periods of time where I will run that factory making revenue of $1 million a year. And so I think if that factory is running at $75 million a year of revenue and we throw a tariff on it, let's say we throw $20 million tariff on it, guess what? That factory will take $55 million to keep running. And that's different than somebody that grows a coffee bean and sells it. And, if they're making a lot of money and we slap a tariff on it, they'll charge less. But if, my sense is with farmers and agricultural type stuff, there's always enough in the way of competition that's trending towards cost to capital. And that's, and so, again, everybody that's saying tariff always leads to higher prices is not right. And Trump saying, they all pay the tariff in every situation. It's not right. That's why I want him to be somewhere in the middle. And I'd want him to be somewhat surgical about it, because you can definitely have the factory run for $1 million a year for a while, but at some point that stops too. And then lack of supply leads to higher prices. So
yeah, and I think that's a not insignificant driving culprit here, is the influence on origin source of supply. And so there's less of it. And there's some other exogenous things, like in the case of coffee, maybe weather. And I haven't kept up with kind of the agricultural commodities as closely as maybe I should have. But there's sorry I went off on that detour, but back to one other element of kind of alternatives the Chinese are pursuing, as pointed out in this Doomberg piece. They talked about thorium molten-salt reactor technology. And why is that interesting? Well, because it's not fundamentally dependent on uranium, one. So you don't have the same type of, I think, overblown nuclear waste concerns. Two, thorium is a pretty significant waste product as it relates to rare earth mining processes. So the Chinese have a lot of it. Now there are some consequences or trade-offs that you make with, I guess, ultimately disposing of the spent thorium molten salt fuel. I think there's some fairly active gamma ray stuff going on. So it may not be uranium, but it's still evidently pretty nasty stuff. But I found it interesting that, they're kind of targeting that maybe we're going to use this in terms of marine propulsion. And they talk about a container ship that, from a capacity standpoint, would be equivalent to a ship that can haul 14,000 container units, which is pretty large. And a TMSR reactor prime mover that would, ultimately generate something equivalent to what we do in our Seawolf class of submarines, which is about 200 megawatts. Again, not that uranium is all that hard to come by. I think China is cited as a 10% world, they consume 10%. Fairly, I guess, import dependent, but the fact that, okay, we got a lot of thorium laying around from all our rare earth mining, and if we can make this work, the established technology is something that we ought to be throwing a lot more money at. There's no need, I think, for breakthroughs because of the performance and the reliability of uranium-based reactors. But again, maybe I'm adding 2 and 2 and getting 20, but I think the point of the piece was, look, we're going to be self-sufficient in this area, and whether it's thorium technology, nuclear reactors generating power on land, or using it as ship prime mover technology. It's just, we're laser focused on this, and we're going to make it happen. And I think the driving motivation again is we're going to be self-contained and self-sufficient across all of the critical supply chains and value chains. I just thought it was an interesting piece, and I think aptly titled as closed loop.
No, and there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, if we talked closed loop, and we had to include Canada, we had to include Mexico in that, I could probably get comfortable doing that. But we, particularly when we start thinking about rare earth minerals and stuff,
we're not going to be closed loop.
Yeah, we cut a deal with Australia, and they've got a lot of that stuff, and hopefully the environmentalists there will let them mine. But at the end of the day, we need to be doing a lot more of that stuff at home. I mean, so
yeah, and the notion, even with all things pointing in our direction or in our favor, how many years or decades does it take to affect that reset? And it's a decades long timeline. And I think, just given the way we think about the world versus the way maybe China thinks about the world, is we're not going to get distracted by social and political issues. We have a mission and an objective. Not to say that's a regime that I would want to be a citizen of, but
unfortunately, it always, with the United States, we don't do day to day very well, but nobody does a catastrophe better than we do. Nobody does. Take down the Nazis. Don't worry, we got this. So I do think if the proverbial doo-doo hit the fan, we could mobilize and make it happen. But I just hate putting ourselves in that position time and time again. So I am going to go through my phone and find my picture of me and Al Gore, and I'll get it to Jacob so we can have it here for our next story,
which is Bloomberg Green, which is a daily. It's one of the free ones that they didn't put behind the paywall. I used to read the energy newsletter every day, but I don't subscribe to Bloomberg after curing my 20-year addiction to Bloomberg Professional. But it was just a gushing piece about his arrival at COP30 in Brazil. Started off with, for many, the clock doesn't start ticking until Al Gore arrives, receiving rockstar type treatment. And so I think, it's just and we talked about, Kirk and I talked about COP last week, and I think we've had some traffic out there on social media about some of the silly things that are coming out of there, like the delegates complaining, or the UN complaining to the Brazilian government that the air conditioning sucks and whatnot. But there's a clear, kind of dinosaur moment, I guess, if you will, if you think about how long Al Gore's been the rock star and the champion of really extreme climate catastrophism. And it just seems so incongruous with where we've come over the last, think back to 5 years ago, what was COP? It was center stage. The U.S. isn't even there in any significant way, and he's kind of taken the stage to, I guess, bask in old glory. And so I almost considered making this a finger of the week, but it's become too tragic and pathetic of a story in my mind to even have any kind of consternation about it. So
yeah, no, I in the year in which Ozzy Osbourne died and Tipper Gore back in the day had gone after Ozzy for his lyrics, and maybe rightfully so. I won't throw that stone, but good grief. Can Al Gore just go away? I mean, how many pictures do we have to see of him getting on a private jet? How many square feet is his mansion in Nashville? It's like, I can't fathom how we let this guy get away with this.
And what's the current AUM of his fund or funds? It's a big number.
Yeah. No. Well, and here's the picture. I'll send it to Jacob. Backstage at U2 in Nashville.
I attached one clip from, or a picture from the long ago South Park ManBearPig episode.
ManBearPig.
I'm cereal.
I'm cereal.
I'm really cereal. Do you know that is the only parody, political parody for which Matt and Trey have actually backpedaled and apologized?
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think in this current run, which has been heavily Trump in a pretty shocking way. I don't know if you've seen any of season 27 and 28. It's out there.
Yeah, no, I've seen a little too much of it, I think. Yeah, no. I've always said if they come after me, I'm just going to gut it up and say it's funny and appreciate it. I'm going to do what Charlie Kirk did, and just, hey, that was funny. I am a master debater,
Yeah, well, it's not surprising that there's this, I don't know, maybe it's a blaze of glory thing for him, but suggesting that, and maybe we are, we could be past peak Trump, and so it's time for you, other countries in leadership, to stiffen your spine and push back on the United States. And ostensibly saying this as one of the higher profile political representatives of the U.S. We had Newsom to talk about last week, and now we've got, the other, I don't even know what to call him anymore because it's a bit of an outdated term. And then you've got, major news outlets like Bloomberg. Just it's beyond sycophantic in terms of how they're characterizing his presence and his aura in Brazil, but it just seems so out of step and outdated relative to what COP has become and what's happened here in the last year or two with some pretty big reversals. Gates, the most significant example of that, and the fact that the U.S. has said, we're just not going to be there and we're going to pull out of Paris.
I think that's right. I did go on Grok and I said, give me an Al Gore joke. What does Al Gore put on his pancakes? Global warming because he invented syrup too? That's not even funny.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Well, one thing I picked up on this, and I just kind of randomly attached it, is there was a piece out in the New York Post yesterday or today talking about the collapse of the Gulf Stream, which ironically, if it goes as the MIT models predict or forecast, or scenario, I should say, let's not get into the loose interchangeability of scenarios and forecasts like the IEA has been guilty of. See how I snuck in an IEA on you there. But essentially it's saying that because of the Greenland melt, we're causing a stagnation. So there's this circulating flow that the Gulf Stream plays a pretty significant role. And if there's a stagnation, then we have too much of the cold influence from the Arctic. In fact, one of the examples was cited that, Europe could see temperatures that are 60 degrees Fahrenheit lower than they are now, which would basically make Europe akin to the Canadian Arctic. So kind of which is it? So global warming is causing the next ice age. And anyway, I'm surprised he didn't latch onto it. Maybe he did in some plenary session, as they like to call them. And they're very...
My question I always like to ask is, tell me the weather patterns that we see that disproves climate change. And they can never tell you that. And I'm like, well, if you can't give me one that disproves it, how can a weather pattern prove it?
Yeah.
Doesn't seem to work. So, well,
where's Kirk?
Enough of, like we said in the 90s, enough of Al Gore. Don't know where Kirk was. I thought he was supposed to join us.
Didn't he instigate this?
I think he kind of did. So anyway, well, good seeing you. Glad your son's surgery went well. We'll keep our fingers crossed of seeing him back on the mound. When can he throw? 9 months?
He'll start throwing probably somewhere between 3 and 4 months post-surgery. So he had what's called an ulnar brace, which means they didn't have to do a reconstruction. So no graft. And the practices and procedures have really advanced. And so relative to the type of tear he had and where it was located, I've done a lot of research and querying over the last few weeks as this was unfolding.
I can imagine.
That the repair procedure is relatively new, so its sample size is smaller than traditional Tommy John or reconstruction. But some of the results and some of the data, particularly as it relates to just fundamental ligament strength, favors slightly, but it's in the kind of 90+% confidence interval. It actually favors the repair. I always looked at it as, look, you take a tendon and replace a ligament, which is just inherently weaker tissue, because you can't condition and strengthen a ligament. You can tendons and muscles. So, right. Well, let's just put something with greater tensile strength and replace that weak link. It doesn't work that way because you have to go through this, I have trouble saying it, ligamentization process, which is part of the graft adaptation to performing as a ligament, and that inherently takes longer. So, we're kind of hoping 9 months, and that's been shown to be pretty reasonable. So, miss the spring season, but be back for a push into his final year.
Fall ball.
But he does get a red shirt. So we'll see about year 5.
Yeah, I was about to say, good luck on that tuition check, Dad.
Yeah, not insignificant.
Exactly. All right, Mark, good seeing you. And if you like today's show, make sure you share it with a friend. Leave us some comments. Remember, I'm very delicate, so don't say anything mean. If you're going to say mean stuff, say it about Mark.
And watch Landman, and then more importantly, watch the Landman recap of each episode throughout the season. It's
Chuck Yates got a job, so
it's must-see TV.
Must-see TV. That's funny.
All right, man.
All right. Peace out.
See ya.